Welcome to hell. Yes, so Welcome to Hell. That is the English translation of this Argentinian movie. I'm not going to pronounce or try to pronounce the Argentinian name or the Spanish language name. It'll be in the title. Anyway, this is a kind of horror drama, and it tells a story of this young woman who goes to a black metal concert one evening with her friend and takes a fancy to the lead singer, and ultimately kind of meets him and they become an item. But it's somewhat of a toxic relationship, you might say, and these are actually murderous musicians with Satan on their minds. And this black metal band want to worship their master Lilith, basically. This girl becomes pregnant, but then she kind of has enough and goes on the run and hides out with her grandmother in the kind of a remote area. However, these satanic musicians track her down. What will happen? You will have to watch the movie and find out. So let us discuss what works in this movie's favour. It is more of a drama, I would suggest, at least for the first 2 acts of this movie, with more overt horror elements in the 3rd act of the movie. So it plays a little bit more like a drama. It's relatively sort of slow, you could say. Although it isn't a particularly long movie, to be fair, but it's not like it's trying to be scary, at least in the first 2 acts. It plays more like a kind of like person that's got involved in a cult and they kind of want to get out of it and things like that, and they seek help from their family. That's kind of the story. But I would say the dramatic elements are quite well done. I mean, our central protagonist, this girl, she's not exactly the kind of like the sharpest tool in the box. She kind of lets herself make bad decisions even after the fact. You know, she's pregnant, yet she's drinking and smoking and things like that. So she's not exactly kind of self-preservation isn't exactly kind of on her mind. So you can kind of see that she's relatively easily kind of manipulated and maneuvered into things. So it's not like she's some girl that you wonder why she ended up in this place. You know, she's all like the lead singer's kind of flirting with me, and you kind of almost understand to a degree when you see someone who really doesn't have the kind of the scruples to kind of really look after themselves, and you can see how they've got sort of manipulated. You might argue it makes them somewhat, unsympathetic, but I don't think it does. It just kind of, she's a flawed person, basically. So I think there are some relatively decent sort of dramatic elements within this movie. The relationship with the grandmother, who is somewhat estranged and appears to be like mute, was an interesting idea as well. And then these black metal Satanists. We don't know too much about them. The movie kind of keeps them somewhat at arm's length, but they do seem to be taking this stuff very seriously, and they seem to have access to money and technology, but they're kind of living in squalor and stuff. So, again, there are some interesting kind of design elements here. And then the 3rd act, it really it ends up being like a siege at the end with these kind of metalists kind of like laying siege to this kind of small kind of farmhouse area. And then we have even more overt creature design type thing near the finale. So that's juxtaposed with the first 2 acts, which are played very much more like a personal relationship drama in some way. So it comes out of left field to a degree, and as such I think is a little more impactful than maybe it would have been. It is a Spanish language movie, but I gotta say I thought all the performances seemed like they were pretty good. And there's a couple of gore sequences which I think are handled pretty well, and the decent amount of kind of practical effects for the gore sequences. There is a creature in this movie which we'll talk about. But yeah, I think the gore effects were all pretty good. And I got to say, it's a simple story, but I think it's somewhat of an interesting one. And I think the kind of the design, ambiguous kind of nature of this movie made it kind of interesting. And, you know, we have a flawed protagonist. What doesn't work, as I've said, it's somewhat ambiguous. I really didn't feel we got to know a huge amount about our kind of antagonists, this group, and really what they actually wanted, why they were kind of so believers and things like that. I mean, we get a little bit, but I didn't really feel like I ever really got to know these characters, and they didn't really feel like true, you know, fleshed out sort of characters, more just sort of like bad guys, antagonists, you know, without really being characters themselves. The movie, when it comes down to it, is very, very simple. You know, there isn't much kind of depth to the story. It's pretty much a very simplistic story when it actually sort of comes down to it. And although I do quite like our flawed individual, our main sort of character, you can't help but think sometimes she's like making, you know, terrible decisions. And, you know, you can kind of, I can understand why people might be a little frustrated with this kind of character to a degree. My main issue, though, to me, because I think the dramatic stuff worked relatively well for the most part. I actually think the third act, which is where we get the more overt stuff, this to me is where the movie fell down a little bit. So we have the siege, first of all. And we have our death metal guys all dressed up in their garb, you know, laying siege to this kind of like farmhouse and the surrounding areas. And it looks like Home Alone, but with like the members of Kiss kind of trying to break in. It looked a little bit silly, I'll be honest with you. As, you know, as badass as these kind of black metal types think it might look, in this situation, it looks goofy. It just looks goofy. I mean, we got this guy and he's got his bare chest out and he's got his like studded wristband and this kind of face paint and he's like running around going, ah, chasing this girl. It looked ridiculous. I didn't really think it looked particularly scary. I mean, I can understand that's your stage makeup and everything, but maybe when they're like, you know, doing their full-on Satanist stuff, maybe just the dark robes would have been a better option or something like that. I don't know. It just looks silly to me, to be honest. And then we have our kind of creature reveal, Lilith. I didn't think it did particularly good. These practical makeup, yeah, it wasn't good. And that's when it really looks like a B movie. She's not on screen for long, this Lilith character. And, you know, there's some things about that I won't spoil for you, but the actual creature effect was a little lame, I have to say. You know, it looked like someone on stilts and a rubber mask. So yeah, the ending was a little bit of a letdown. I mean, the idea of the story was fine, but just the execution of the actual visuals wasn't particularly strong. I'll give it a 5 out of 10. It's an okay kind of like dramatic horror movie. If you like, you know, heavy metal horror, then maybe it might be one to check out. 5 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think? Please do leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time.